Hello and welcome to another episode of It Came From the Page. And today we are talking about two books. Yes, I know, a booktube channel that's not only hauling books, we're going to talk about books. Wow. Breaking new ground. I know. I usually when I want to review maybe a piece of art, I normally like to kind of find a double feature, something to pair two pieces of art with and kind of compare, contrast, talk about their themes, everything like that. Obviously, that's not a requirement to talk about art. Sometimes you just want to talk about a single piece of art, but I always like pairing things together and then just kind of talking about them. And this was completely unplanned. This just happened to be a thing that just occurred kind of randomly, without any planning at all. And today we are talking about two sci-fi horror books from the late 80s. We're talking about Stephen King's The Tommyknockers from 1987. And yes, we've got a hardcover here. This hardcover I got from a thrift store, and you can't smell it, but I can. This book smells like smoke. Anyways, and there's no book that's more appropriate to have that just smells like smoke than the Tommyknockers. And from 1988, just a year later, Robert R. McCammon's Stinger. And this was actually my very first Robert R. McCammon book. Definitely not my first King book. I've read quite a few King books, but this one is the second book chronologically. So I'm going to talk about this one after I kind of talk about Tommyknockers, and then we'll kind of compare and contrast a little bit. So this is Tommyknockers from 1987. This was actually one of the best-selling books of the 1980s, which is completely crazy. This is in the top 10 best-selling books of the 80s, which is why, as a hardcover, super easy to find this in a hardcover. Usually, I've seen them all the time at thrift stores. I don't think I ever want to replace this one just because it smells like smoke, and again, that's very apt for this. I don't smoke, so it's very funny to have something that just reeks of cigarettes, but very appropriate for this book. I'm going to put it down because it's a heavy hardcover. So if you've never read Tommyknockers, Tommyknockers is definitely not one of the more well-loved King books. In fact, a lot of people call it one of his worst books ever. I know even King himself has kind of bashed this book time and time again. And to be fair, that for a lot of reasons, that is warranted. And basically, Tommyknockers is an alien invasion story, but it starts with the aliens already here. Millions and millions of years ago, we find out that an alien ship crash landed on Earth. And in Maine, of course, this is a Stephen King book, of course it takes place in Maine. In a small town, a woman is going through the forest, Bobby Anderson with her dog, and she just stumbles upon it, and she just starts to dig up this spacecraft. And as she digs up the spacecraft, the aliens, who are long dead, still somehow exist on the psychic plane and slowly start to change everyone in this town, this small little town, and turns them into aliens, essentially. Aliens called the Tommyknockers. And this is a book that starts out really, really strong. I would say the first 200 pages of this, most people would agree, are just amazing King writing. Then it gets weird and wild, and I think if you're just going from structure and format, it's kind of a mess. There are a lot of ideas being displayed here, and not all of them are done super well. The character of Bobby Anderson, who we start out with, is a great character. I really, really liked her. This is a middle-aged woman. I really like when King starts to tackle and deal with characters who are of middle age. It's a lot more interesting than reading about, young teens all the time, which is, a lot. Especially if you're reading 80s horror. There's, a lot of, teens are getting into mischief. Well, and, there's plenty of books where I love that. But I do like leads that are not, teenagers. So these are a middle-aged woman and her dog. And her dog slowly starts to transform, so the dog starts to go through weird transformations. And then she takes it to the vet, and then when she's at the vet with this dog, everything starts going crazy, and all these animals start going nuts. So you're like, oh my goodness, something's going on with this dog. And then that's the last time you really deal with true Bobby Anderson, because it takes a huge swing and introduces an entirely new character who is referenced in the Bobby chapters as somebody who she confides in. But he is, bar none, the most unlikable king protagonist I think I've ever encountered. Yes, that's including Jack Torrance, who literally tried to kill his family. Guard is is less likable than that. Which, again, I don't really think is that's not a criticism, by the way. It's always really interesting when you tackle characters that are, at their core, extremely flawed. We find out that Guard is somebody who is like a blackout alcoholic. And in one of his many blackouts, we found out at one point he shot his wife. We never know why. And that's one of the very rare cases, because if you read Stephen King books, you normally know all of the whys, like for everything. He is a very much a descriptive writer who wants to tell you everything and wants to go into exhaustive detail. And in this one, you just get hints and the general idea that it was like a drunken argument gone wrong. We know that his wife survived. Obviously, though, she like divorced him and they're not together anymore. And we follow him when he's at this poetry reading symposium. He reads this amazing bit of poetry that like everyone is like, oh my goodness, that's the best poetry I've ever heard. Oh my goodness. And then he gets really drunk at a party and then starts to ramble about nuclear energy and its dangers at this party for a lot of pages. To be fair, I read this in audiobook format just because I had a trial to Scribd and there was like a bunch of King audiobooks, so I just ran like going through all of these King audiobooks one after the other, and I ended up, this was one of the ones that I listened to, and even listening to it, like, he goes on a long time at this party. But this party scene is very interesting because you really get to see how Guard slowly goes more and more like unhinged the more alcohol he consumes. And he is someone who's trying to get off of alcohol, but he just gets kind of ramped back in by another person in this poetry competition. And then after he does his big read, he gets drunker and drunker, and this huge fiasco happens. And he at one point, he's worried that he's ranting once gave someone a heart attack. We never find out if that happened, which is fascinating. We do not know the truth about whether or not this person actually had a heart attack and maybe even died because of this party interaction. And Guard especially doesn't know, because pretty much as soon as he leaves the party, he is blackout drunk. And then he wakes up like 3 days later in a very precarious situation and is thinking about committing suicide. There's a lot of suicidal ideation in this book, especially from Guard. And then he goes back to visit Bobby because he has this idea that he's to visit Bobby and find out something's wrong. And of course something is wrong. She's slowly become an alien. And that's where basically the book just kind of takes off from there. And Guard is, throughout this entire process, like this entire book goes on, and there's a huge portion, the second portion of this book is really meaty and has a lot of stuff packed in here, a lot of characters packed in here, and Guard throughout that entire second chapter is just getting blackout drunk and slowly unburying this spaceship. And essentially we learn that because he has this metal plate in his head, he's not becoming a Tommyknocker right away. And the real meat and potatoes of this book, and the reason why I think I really did enjoy this book, is it is another example of Stephen King just overdoing it, explaining the history of a town. And it's the town of Haven. And if you've read other King books, surprisingly enough, Tommyknockers, like, connects like all these disparate elements of older King books. Like we have fire starters drawn in, we have things from the Dead Zone drawn in, a whole bunch of stuff from It with Derry. I believe there are some Pet Cemetery references. There's a lot. At one point, a character from The Talisman shows up. And for me, some of those books I haven't read. I haven't read Pet Cemetery yet. It's on the list. And I have not read Talisman yet, and it's on the list, obviously. But I didn't feel like they disrupt, like those references, I don't feel like disrupted the story. They're just really kind of calmly woven in. And even if you haven't read any of those stories, you will still be okay with those references. But it does tie everything together in a really interesting way. But the town of Haven is right next to the town of Derry, which is, the Derry is from It, is the city from It. So Haven is like the super, super small town. And you really learn about the entire history of this town. How did it get its name? How did its name get changed? What kind of characters showed up in the town? Why is this person here? Why is that? And it goes in depth. And there is so much he crams into this book. And I love Stephen King just rambling on about a town for ages and ages and telling me all these historical things and all this history of a town. I think that's some of the stuff he does best. I know in It, there are entire huge chapters that are just the interlude chapters where it just tells the history of Derry and how Pennywise kind of weaved in and out of this town. And it's some of the best stuff that King has ever written, in my opinion. So when he is just given the details of the town, I love it. Then we get into the town itself, and, you know, there's a lot of characters in this town. And what's fascinating about this is, so as this spaceship starts to become on Earth, everyone in the town slowly starts to transform into these alien beings. And it happens slowly at first. And some of the early things is like, oh, people can start reading people's minds. Some people are interpreting the change as like religious symbols talking to them. And there's all, like, some people who have doll collections, their dolls start talking to them. And there's like some creepy stuff in here. But it's really a story about all of these side characters slowly becoming one character. And which is going to be interesting when we talk about Robert R. McCammon STINGER, is that it's kind of the opposite of that. But this one is all these side characters are slowly becoming one character because it's like this hive mind Tommyknocker vibe. And as it goes on, these characters start to lose their bits of individuality and start becoming one entity, which is really, really interesting. Now, one of the things about part 2, which is this big, huge, chunky part of the book, is that a lot of characters are introduced. Some characters are better and more interesting than others. I think Ruth McCausland, who is one of the biggest characters in this book, and does have some of the biggest impact on this book, who's like this deputy of this area. She's got a really interesting chapter about her history. But then there's a whole bunch of other characters, and some of them are interesting, some of them are not so interesting. And I think this is one of the reasons why people don't love this book, is because, again, it's structurally kind of a mess. Because we learn about what happens to Ruth McCausland before we're even properly introduced to Ruth McCausland. So they will have, like, characters will be like, wow, can you believe that crazy thing happened? And then you're like, whoa, what crazy thing happened? Did I miss something in this book? And then it's like, oh no, they're setting up a flashback. And it's like this one huge flashback that's like hours. It's like probably was like, I think it was like a chapters, a really, really long chapter. And it's just structurally just weird. Like, it's not how you would normally tell a story, and not even how King would normally tell a story, because King is normally really good at the structure and format. And now I know this is one of the times in his life that he was going through a lot of substance abuse issues. And you really do feel that in that character of Jim Gardner, because Gard is in a lot of ways a reflection of, I think, where King was in his own life, where he is really felt like he's stuck in a scenario and he doesn't know what to do other than keep working. And I almost wonder if that's kind of King talking about himself, not knowing what to do about his substance abuse issues, and just keeps writing. Instead of like digging out an alien spaceship, it's just about writing. Obviously, I can't say that for sure, right? I that's just me thinking upon it and thinking upon some of the stories that he's told about this time in his life. So take that with a grain of salt. Obviously, I cannot tell you whether or not that's accurate or not. And this book just sticks with me. It stuck with me a lot. And I think one of the things that stuck with me most about this book is how our character, maybe our lead protagonist, Jim Gardner, is incredibly unlikable. And I think that makes this a really fascinating and powerful book, in that this is a person who, like, he's a bad person. He's done a lot of bad things. And it's like, what would it be like if the entire human race depended on this one person, and this was a bad person who messed up a lot but wanted to be better, kind of thing. And I think it's really fascinating. And I don't think King absolves Guard of any of his issues. I have read that some people do feel like that happened. So I guess that's whether or not how you read the character of Jim Gardner, I guess, would probably affect your opinion on this book. Because like I said, he's unlikable, but he does do the right thing at the end. And he does do a lot of hard things and make a lot of hard decisions. And it is just, I don't know, it's a fascinating thing. Like, what about the worst person you know saves the world? And how is that, how do you contextualize a life? How do you contextualize what someone does in a life? And I just think it's really interesting questions to ask. And I just think that King really just allows us to not like Gardner, and to not have him be a traditional hero in a lot of ways that I think is really interesting. And this book has just stuck with me. There is a lot of really great horror images. There's like characters who are like stuck in this goo. There's places that people who get like trapped on alien planets, and it's like thinking of the like existential dread of both of those situations really messed with me. The loss of self in a lot of these characters really resonated with me in a lot of in a personal way. Again, that's I'm gonna beat a dead horse here because I'm gonna probably talk about it a lot, but a big part of my life is that I had a stroke. After the stroke, there was a big kind of crisis for me, thinking about whether or not I lost something. Am I the same person as I was when I had the stroke? How do I contextualize what I've lost and what I've gained and who I am? And in a way that I thought this book really does kind of tackle that a lot. It doesn't serve all of its characters well, though. Like Bobby Anderson is a great character. I think Stephen King does not really give her time in the sun, especially when she's gone. We know why it's sad that she's gone, but we don't really sit with her as she goes away. When Guard and her kind of reunite, there's already a significant difference in who she is. And as somebody who really liked that character, really thought some of the decisions that character makes are fascinating, in that I would really like to be in her head when she made those decisions and understand. Now, other thing I like about this book is that it's just trashy as hell near the end. We have characters like roaming around with ray guns, like all these small town characters who like build ray guns. There's like killer vacuums. At one point, Guard has to fight off a killer vacuum cleaner. There's like smoke detector bombs that like drones that like hover around, and if they hit you, they blow up. There is a sequence where cops have a gunfight with a living Coke machine. So near the end of this book, it just gets wild and crazy and exciting and exuberant. And it is trashy, 100%. There's like a lot of trashy elements of this book, and it's very fascinating to read it, because reading King, it is very much talking about and looking at the dichotomy of this book, in that there are a lot of really good chapters at the beginning of this book. There's a lot of really good things that King does well. And then it ends in a way that's like very much like a trashy, pulpy adventure story. And it doesn't really meld with some of the bigger ideas that are being discussed in this book. And I just thought that was fascinating. The Tommyknockers themselves, as the central alien species, we kind of discover that they are not big inventors. They don't really understand science and the science that they're able to do. They just know how to build things. They don't actually know what they're building or why or how it works. So they're just this race who just like consumes and knows how to build things, but they don't really know anything more than that. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating. There are issues with this book. There are a lot of dated elements of this book, and I don't think everything works in this book. But like I said, there are just scenes in this book that really captured me and really stuck in my head. It's been a while since I have read the Tommyknockers, but I haven't stopped thinking about it. There are I think there's probably about 5 books in between me reading the Tommyknockers and now, and it still sticks with me. I think it's a very powerful story. It's a messy story. It's a fascinating read. It's a fascinating read. Now we will go on to Robert R. McCammon STINGER. I think there's a lot of things in common with Tommyknockers. They both involve a small town. They both involve an alien spaceship that creates basically like a dome around a city, because there's like a force field in the Tommyknockers, but it's not really a force field. It just makes it so people who come into the town can't really leave, but someone could still drive through the town. But if you're in the town long enough, you can't like leave anymore, which is just fascinating. Again, one thing to mention about the Tommyknockers as well, it doesn't deal with women characters as well. There are some writing problems with some of the characters. I'm not here to defend the Tommyknockers, just talk about what I found interesting about it. That much is for sure. But Stinger takes a kind of a different approach, where Stinger is not about the loss of self. It's a lot about identity and who you actually are as a person and why you are the way that you are. And again, I thought this was just going to be, hey, a creepy alien shows up and just kills people for 500 pages. And in a way, yes, that does happen. But it's about a lot more than that, and I was really, really impressed. This one takes place in Texas, and there's like this border town that's right near Mexico. So there are 2 elements of this town, and one part of it is Inferno, and the other part I believe is called Border Town, which fascinating. And there is a big racial divide here because you have a lot of white Texans, and they are in direct kind of opposition to the Hispanic population, who have kind of always lived there. And they have this town that's pretty much this melting pot of these different cultures. And it goes into a lot about what makes a person tick, why a person is the way they are. This one also has quite a few unlikable characters. I think some of the stuff that I don't feel like happens with Jim Gardner in Tommyknockers does kind of happen here. There is a sheriff character who is pretty despicable and racist, and they go into his racism. We learn why he's racist, stuff like that, but it never excuses it. It's just kind of discussing his racism. He's also very corrupt. He's like taking money, and at one point he does step up and do the right thing and help save people, and it's kind of treated like a heroic moment, and it is, but it isn't. It is one of those scenarios where I think that they have him save other white people, so it doesn't mean as much. So him finally, getting motivated and doing the right thing doesn't feel as impactful as it would have if it had been him dealing with his racism and actually helping the entire town, not just the white part. But I do think they kind of let him off the hook. But he's not the central character. He's a side character. And the central character and the central relationships is all about these two gangs. There's two gangs in the town, which is the Renegades and the Rattlesnakes. And the Renegades is like the white, affluent portion of the city. Not affluent because the town is dying. It was once affluent. It was built as like a mining town, and then the mine dried up. So everyone is all poor. Everyone in this town is poor, and this entire the entire town is basically going to get shut down soon because the school's shutting down. No one has any money anymore because this mine dried up. But it used to be a more affluent area. And then you have the Rattlesnakes, which is the Hispanic gang. And you really get a lot of information on the posturing between these two people. You learn why people are racist, why they think the way they think, and learn to get above it. And learn to stop, and change. And you see a lot more change in this book from the younger characters than you do the older characters, which is accurate to how it is in real life. It's a lot easier to change when you are young versus when you are older and set in your ways, and the institutional racism has really been driven home to you. When you're younger, it's a lot easier to change your ways and get out of that. That being said, there are a lot of older people who are just fine, who have dealt with that when they were younger or whatever, and are enlightened. But there also are a lot of old racist white people, obviously. No surprise there. I just thought this was a really interesting book because it's almost like West Side Story, but they learn how to get along. They learn how to work together. They learn how to team up to defeat this crazy villain. And some of another one of the similarities about the loss of self, which I think was really interesting in this book, is that instead of all these side characters becoming one, it's all of these side characters who start out opposed and end with the same goal. So they don't become the same person, they just get the same goal, and that goal is survival. And one of the things about the Tommyknockers is they are these characters are slowly turning into aliens, and how this book works is Stinger, which is the titular villain of the book. He is searching out for this character called the Guardian who has crash landed here. And I'll get into her in a second, but as he goes through the town, if he consumes a person, he takes their biological information and makes this crazy combination of himself and this person. So there are people who show up and they have these crazy needle teeth. They have the scaly claws that are filled tipped with little saw blades that'll just tear you up if they get near you. And it's this almost bastardization of this person that people knew, and they just get eaten and taken and they die from Stinger, and then Stinger creates a messed up version of them to act as his avatar on to the outside worlds, and learns the speech patterns and everything like that, and communicates with the humans through these terrifying doppelgangers. And in a way, it is interesting because in a way it's kind of is like the Tommyknockers in that you're just regurgitating something that isn't the truth anymore, this altered version of something and it's just very interesting because it's less about a person going through that experience because a person is dead, and more of just oh wow, I think of these people or this person in a way that's monstrous. So it's if you see somebody who you are opposed to, and then you see this bastardized version of them, and you're oh, that's an actual monster. Well, maybe that original person wasn't so bad. and it's really, really fascinating in that regard. And I think they do a lot of really in-depth character work in Stinger that I just think is just fascinating. And I love small town stories. I think small town stories are always an enjoyable setting. And I think it's fascinating that both of these take place in small towns. Now, there is a character called the Guardian that I didn't mention, and that is a character who like originally like lives in this like silver ball, and it can put its consciousness into a vessel. So this consciousness, like it takes over a little girl, and then the little girl's soul goes into this little ball. But it's not bad. Like the Guardian is a good guy, and the Guardian is working towards freeing the galaxy, basically. And Stinger works for this thing called like the House of Fists, which is like this evil intergalactic conquering nation, and the place where the Guardian was from was one of the places that got invaded, and she's like escaping them and blah blah blah. So she was like put in prison, and then she escaped the prison, and then they send Stinger, who's like an intergalactic bounty hunter, to get her. Essentially, is that story. But it does deal with a character who takes over somebody, but it's a good thing. And eventually there is that whole thing about like, look, this thing now wants my daughter, who's like Jesse and Tom, who is like this couple who, again, middle-aged couple, which I thought was really nice. Jesse is a veterinarian and Tom is a teacher, and their daughter is the one who gets like taken over. And it's just a lot of them having to deal with the fact that that's not their daughter anymore. Can they get their daughter back? Will this entity give their daughter back? If Stinger gets the Guardian, essentially, what will happen to their daughter? Will it kill their daughter? And like, there's a lot of really interesting elements of loss in that regard. But the Guardian is a hero. And as a whole, I just thought this was a very fascinating, really well-written book. I'm definitely going to check out more Robert R. McCammon books. I was really moved by the end of this book. This book did bring me to tears. And again, we have the day is saved by a very unrepentant, well, not unrepentant, both of these characters are, Jim Gardner and this character are very repentant of their actions, but they are people who are lost in their addictions, essentially, completely, and they've done terrible things while in their addictions. And the character in this book, who is the father of one of the leads of the Renegades, and he has kind of brought his own racist tendencies and like kind of put them onto his son, and that's why his son is so like diametrically opposed to the rattlesnakes and blah 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 blah. And they go into that a lot, and that's the character that at the end of the day is the one who saves everyone. And it's like this very fascinating idea that both of these books tackle, which is like a person lost in their addictions has to save the world. They're not a good person. They've done things that are horrible. Are they redeemed? Or what? And I don't think in either of these cases, I don't think that either author lets these characters off the hook, but they do explore them in very fascinating ways, in a way that I found that was actually very interesting in both cases, in that these characters are lost, in this case it was alcohol for both, they're lost in their addictions, and this world starts crumbling around them, and they are in a position where they're going to have to try and save the world, save everyone, and they do. And it's a really, like, that idea is just very fascinating. Like the idea of the worst person you know just made a great point. That meme, right? Like the worst person you know just made a great point. But it's like the worst person you know just saved the world. And how do we deal with the aftermath of that? And I was really moved by both stories. Stinger is better than Tommyknockers. The Tommyknockers does have a lot of issues. Like I said, some of the women are not written particularly well. Some of King's more worse writing styles does kind of leak into the Tommyknockers a little bit, where he kind of gets... he can get stuck in a way of speaking for certain characters that I just hate. it's really hard to explain, but when he gets into somebody who's like a small town bumbling idiot, and the way that he creates their speech patterns, especially listening to it in an audiobook, was just, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. This one I actually read. So there you go. This one was just Stinger I just read. And yeah, I thought Stinger was a really, really good book. And I will be thinking about it for a long time. I was moved by this. I was thrilled by this. I just really loved the characters, the ideas on display on both of these. And, you know, they're all talking about messy topics. This is late 80s. So both books are dealing with topics and ideas like addiction. This book deals with racism. Does it nail it always? I don't think so. But is it it's having that conversation in a time where no one was asking you to have that conversation. You didn't have to have that conversation. And just trying to work this out and talk about these issues. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. And I've just really been kind of drawn through messy depictions of conversations that we don't have enough. And if we don't talk about it, these things nothing will happen. If you don't understand why someone's racist, you don't understand the racism or sexism or any of these, like homophobia, any of these issues. If you don't tackle them and discuss them and aren't afraid to be wrong, because especially if you don't belong to any of those categories, you're going to be wrong. And the most important part is to listen, to change your opinions on things, to grow, and to be better. And I think both of these books are about growth and about being better and about what does it mean to be a bad person and try to and be better eventually. And I think they do it a bit messy in both cases. Stinger, I think, deals with a lot of the individual elements of racism, but I don't think it deals with the structural elements of racism, which is a very important part in understanding the societies that we all live in. I live in Canada, and Canada has a lot of racism. If you don't know about Canada's racism, I would suggest you look up things like the residential schools, see how we've treated the Indigenous population. We've done terrible things. White people, I mean Canadians, as in the white people. And it's the structural racism plays a huge part into that. And I don't think this book tackles the idea of the structural racism as much as it does the individual racism. But hey, that's still very important to talk about and to discover and to get into. And also, for both of these books, I thought the alien parts were very fun and very exciting and scary. Like, Stinger has some moments that are outright scary and terrifying. And like this idea of like struggling for your life against something that's way more powerful than you that you don't understand. Amazing. And these creatures, all these creature works are really fascinating and really captured my mind. So I was like, oh, these are fun creature features. Both of these I went in thinking like, oh, these are going to be fun creature features. And I just got a lot more out of them than that. If you've read any of these books, I would love to hear. So please let me know in the comments below. And as always, it came from the page. Like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.